I assume you've all at some point heard the saying, don't miss the forest for the trees. If you haven't, maybe you're one of the few in here who haven't run across that, or maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know for sure. It's a saying that basically means don't get so wrapped up in the details that you miss the bigger picture. I struggled with this idea as a kid in a little bit different way, maybe a more literal way. We lived in Kingwood for a while, initially when we moved from the Midland, Odessa area, and we came over here to the larger Houston area. And we moved to Kingwood, and we were there from about my third grade, midway through my third grade year to about seventh grade. And those years were the part of my bike riding years. More than today, that was what you did. You got out. I mean, there were seasons where I was on a skateboard, but it was either a skateboard or a bike out. That's how you got around. I mean, if you were financially stable enough, financially well off enough to have an Atari, the most advanced video game system of the day, you could only play Pac-Man for so long. We did life outside. And so, also, amidst the Kingwood area, if you've ever driven out around there, it looks a lot different than the Katy area. We've got a lot of trees. A lot of pine trees. And throughout that Kingwood area, they have something that they call a green belt system. And it's these paths that they have that go in and out through neighborhoods, and they go, sometimes the path goes like behind a row of houses. Sometimes it literally was in the middle of just trees. And at that point, they were asphalt-topped paths and trails that weaved around out there. And they loved those trees so much that as they were creating this greenbelt system, it wasn't uncommon that you would be going along and you would see where they chose to change the path of the greenbelt in order not to take down a tree. Well, my family and I, we would take these long bike rides. I remember we would all get on a bike. My dad had that little seat, it's probably considered unsafe today, but that seat on the back of the bike where my baby brother would ride and bounce along on the back of the bike, and mom was going, and I'd be back there somewhere in the rear. And more times than I can count, that path would turn, I wouldn't, and I would smack a tree at full speed. I would get up, and about the time I got up and got back on my bike, I would see my dad had turned around. He'd realize Matt had hit another tree. And he'd turn around somewhere and he'd be headed back to check on me. And, I'd be okay, just hit a tree, getting back up on the bike to take off again. And this happened so often, so many times. My brain, I think, when I should have been focused on the path that I was biking down, what trees might be popping up in front of me, or where the path turned or didn't turn. I mean, I was sitting there thinking about the baseball cards that I wanted, or the next trade that I was going to make with my friend, or what sneakers that I wanted to have. It was on anything except for those trees that took me by surprise. I feel like that same reality, that feeling represents so much of, at least in my estimation, life. I feel like the circumstances of life, for me, maybe for some of you, that it's so hard to keep a perspective of this bigger picture. It's so hard to keep a perspective of the forest because the circumstances of daily life keep smacking me in the face. I mean, if it's not this, then it's something else, but there's always something that seems to be showing up along the path, reminding me of the trees and preventing me from having that perspective of the bigger picture, the forest. It requires intention, I think, to keep that perspective and that mindset. And I also think we just need to be reminded often to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. We need to be reminded of that perspective that there is more than the trees that we might have run into at full speed this past week or this past month. But there's a forest of life. There's a bigger narrative out there. My hope and prayer is today, as we continue in this journey of the book of Esther, that we get reminded of that bigger picture. There's some history that we need to catch up on this morning as we get into chapter 9. If you're new with us, we've been working our way through the book of Esther, through this amazing story. And so much history and there's so much context that what I've tried to do is kind of provide the context as we kind of need to deal with it each week. And there's a big chunk of it that I need to bring you up to speed on as it relates to this week and may help connect some dots of some previous weeks as well. And that is the background, the history of the relationship between Haman and Mordecai, but more specifically, Haman and the Jews, Haman's kindred and the Jews. Haman, the character that we've been following through this story, he's referred to at least 5 times that we've seen. These are all coming through chapter 8, 5 times as Haman the Agagite. And we've flown over that. We haven't spent time on it, but there's a reason that each of these 5 times we have that repeated. There's emphasis on that reality, on who Haman is and this description of him. We saw it 2 times just last Sunday as we were looking at chapter 8. So I want to talk about that word for just a minute. Agagite. And Agag was this derogatory term that we see here from the author of Esther. And it's in reference to an Amalekite king who Saul captured and Samuel killed in 1 Samuel chapter 15. This term is derogatory because it is a term used to describe one of the greatest, if not the greatest, adversarial people group to the nation of Israel. Haman was an Amalekite, being referred to as an Agag, or one who had followed or involved with the people group of this king, an Amalekite. And the author wants us to know this, and he wants us to see the importance of it. The saga, the historical saga that takes place between Israel and the Amalekites begins when the people of Israel are escaping Egypt. If you remember, they're in slavery in Egypt. They're set free. Of course, this is when the amazing story happens of the Red Sea being parted and them coming across it. Well, as they're fleeing and they're traveling and they're going to this promised land, the Amalekites come and attack them as they are on this journey and attack them from behind. This is recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 25, and we also see some references to it in Exodus. I'll just read those quickly. You don't need to turn there, but just allow me to kind of fill you in on what's happened here and how this relationship started. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17 says, "Remember what Amalek did to you as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God." Okay, so here's the significance of this. The relationship, this adversarial relationship between the Amalekites and the people of Israel begins as the Amalekites attack them and attack from the rear, which means they attacked where the women and the children and the elderly were. That's who was in the back of this traveling people group as they journeyed forward towards the promised land. That wasn't okay. That's never been okay. Today, in our current day, we have something called the Geneva Convention. If you don't know what it is, you've probably heard it on the news before, but in an oversimplified kind of explanation, it's this international law, right? Kind of this agreed upon set of standards. And part of that is chaplains and medics, you aren't supposed to target them in war. I know it seems crazy. There are rules in war, but there are. In a sense, it's like those who aren't targeting you, you shouldn't target them. But this isn't something new that the Geneva Convention came up with. This has been, it's existed throughout time. It was accepted that you shouldn't be targeting specifically an attack on the women and the children and the elderly. And the Amalekites do just that. And so you can imagine how this opposition between these two people groups escalates. It's a story in that moment that's familiar probably to some of you, that moment. Maybe you remember back to the flannel boards of Sunday school. Moses, as long as he held his hand up in the air, they were victorious. But when his hand came down out of the air, the Amalekites began to be victorious. Remember, Aaron and Hur come and they hold his hands in the air so that the Israelites can defend themselves. That's this first meeting. And speaking of this meeting, it's referenced in Exodus. It says, the Lord says to Moses, speaking about this first meeting between the Amalekites and the people of Israel, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the years of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out of the memory of Amalek from under heaven. So we're given this promise. Moses is given this promise from the Lord that this isn't the time right now as they were defending themselves, as the Amalekites were attacking the women and the children here. They were going to defend themselves, but they needed to just keep moving. And God gave a promise that he will enact judgment on the people, on the Amalekites. But now's not the time. So several hundred years later, we see the Amalekites surface again. This time, God tells King Saul, attack the Amalekites. Spare no one, not even their animals. In a culture that revolves around the oral storytelling of truth, of history, everyone would have known of the promise of God. Everyone would have known of the Amalekite attack on the people of Israel. It happened several hundred years previously. So in their minds, they're thinking, okay, maybe this is the time. Maybe this is the time that God is going to move in such a way that he fulfills his promise that he gave to Moses. And yet, Saul was disobedient. He did not do as the Lord had instructed. This would have been the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those who were amidst those who were attacked as they fled Egypt. Saul's disobedient. He did not do as the Lord had instructed, and the saga continues of this adversarial relationship between the Amalekites and the Israelites. It continues later. Even David, his camp is attacked by the Amalekites. You see this building up of this tension and this protagonist, antagonist, the enemy of the people of God. It continues building and building and building. And then when we get to the book of Esther, we come into contact with Haman, the Agagite. Haman, the one who is attached to this people group, the Amalekites. They hated the Jews And the Jews were aware of this promise that they had from God. So as we look at chapter 9, we need to remember that we're dropping into a moment here where two decrees, two laws are both true and active. We're dropping into a moment of history where first, remember, Haman had convinced the king to issue this edict that all of the Jews could be killed on this specific day. They could all be killed and all of their stuff could be plundered. Then later, we looked at last Sunday, Esther is able to come to the king and describe to her what had been happening after these other series of events led up to it. And the king then issues another decree that says, on that same specified day, the Jews can defend themselves against anyone who attacks them. Both of these edicts are issued and both remain in place because you couldn't do anything to remove an edict once the king had issued it. It was chapter 8, verse 11, last Sunday that we read. The king allowed the Jews to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate, which is the same language as the other edict, any armed force of any people or province that might attack them. So about 11 months has passed. And now we're going to arrive on that day. The day that they dreaded, the day that they feared, the day that both of these edicts spoke of. Chapter 9, verse 1. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain, watch this verse, the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. That's such an awesome phrase right there. I have mixed feelings about it. Part of me wants to say, well, don't tell us how it ends. Tell us the whole story. Wait to the end so we can feel it. But he tells us how it's going to end right there at the beginning of the chapter. I mean, we kind of know, we expect it, but still there's that part of me that says, no, build up the tension. But he says it right there from the opening. The reverse occurred. The New American Standard Translation says, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary. And I love Eugene Peterson's paraphrase in the Message says, but the tables are now turned. Basically what all these people expected to happen or what they expected to accomplish, the opposite took place. Our two big SAT theological ideas that we've talked about through this series. Providence of God and the sovereignty of God. Providence of God is constant interaction with his creation. Providence, interaction with his creation. Second one, the sovereignty of God, his absolute and unrivaled authority over all things. God was not surprised any step of the way here. He's not surprised by the king's neglect as we rewind back when the king neglected to elevate and to honor Mordecai because he was the one who saved his life. God was not surprised. God was not surprised at Haman's hatred of the Jews. God was not surprised when a series of events takes place where Haman talks the king into issuing this decree instructing the Jews are to be murdered. God was sovereign amidst every single second of every one of those moments. God was not surprised the day that the Jews came under attack. Right here in chapter 9. Not only was God sovereign, but it was in his providence. It was amidst God's working, amidst his creation. He had already dealt with Haman. He had already issued this edict that they could gather, they could prepare, and they could defend themselves. It was his providential hand as the sovereign king that turns the tables on the enemies of God and his people. Verse 2, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout all of the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. No one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All of the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all of the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. Verse 5, the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they had pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also killed, now we've got a bit of a Jewish phone book moment here with these names. These are the sons of Haman, Parshandatha and Dilphon and Aspatha and Poratha and Adalia and Aridatha and Parmashta and Arisai and Aridai and Vizatha. Anybody else want to try that? Those are the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. All of these they killed. And it says, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So the Jews here, they're not initiating the attack. They're doing exactly what the edict gave them permission to do. They're defending themselves against all of those who are attacking them. They're defending themselves, and in Susa we see here that there are 500 of their attackers who are killed, and yet the Jews don't lay a hand on their things, their stuff. Verse 11, that very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. So the king finds out what's going on. The king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? That's not a question, that's an exclamation. It's like, and probably more has happened. And then he asks Esther, now what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. So the king is saying, okay, they've defended themselves. Now, do you have any other requests? Esther, remember, she's in this place where she's been embracing confidence in who she is, her identity as a Jew, her confidence in God's move. As she walks in deeper and deeper confidence of this, she comes right out of the gate with another request. Esther says, verse 13, if it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also. Remember, the edict was for one day. Let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. Let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king, this is his response, commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. So Esther's request of the king, would you extend the edict one more day? I don't think for a minute that what Esther had in her heart here was some desire for more bloodshed for the sake of bloodshed. I don't think she was going after just this revenge idea or vengeance. I think Esther knew this isn't over. I don't know if people were telling her that. Maybe she literally had heard it from people, or she was just aware of the history behind this moment. You know, it's not just going to go away. All of this isn't just going to vanish after one day. And so she asked, can we extend it just one more day? She also asked that the sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. They were already dead. And gallows was basically a stake, right, that was in the ground. We saw it was 7 stories tall from Haman's request. But basically, the dead were put on display. It was a way to display basically a sign or a message to others. here, what Esther is asking for is, will you take them as those who are already dead? Would you display them to show them that if they attack us, we will defend ourselves? This is what happens. Esther's right about it not being over. The evidence is in the 300 more attackers killed in verse 15 that we just read, but also here, what we'll read in this little final paragraph that we'll look at today, verse 16. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives. And they got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000. Can you imagine what would have happened if Esther would not have made that request? 75,000 of those who hated them, and again we see in reference to the Jews, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested, and they made that day feasting and gladness. The Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and the 14th, and they rested on the 15th, making that day of feasting, that a day of feasting and gladness. 19, therefore the Jews of the villages who lived in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So this is what's taking place outside of the main city. All of these other provinces we talked about, when these edicts were sent out, the roadway system, how easy it would have been on kind of this Persian Pony Express, right? Everybody would have received word. And amidst all of these provinces, the Jews get attacked, and they defend themselves to the extent of 75,000 lives being lost. Why were there so many that came against them? Why were there so many who came to attack the Jews on this day? And to some extent, we don't know the answer to that. I think inasmuch as I have already tried to bring you up to speed on this historical background, the answer that we know is how much animosity there was that's culminating at this moment that had gone back generations and generations. The animosity that existed between the Amalekites and the people of Israel. See, what God promised in Deuteronomy chapter 25, because of what took place in Exodus 17, did not come to fruition because of Saul's disobedience, referenced a few minutes ago. His promise comes to fruition amidst the story of Esther. This is the last time in Old Testament history that we have a mention of the Amalekites. This long-standing promise that it took generations, not because God was slow to move, not because God was making any kind of mistake, not because anything surprised God along the way, but in his sovereignty, amidst his providential work, it's generations before God's promise appears here to come to fulfillment. And in God's providence, it was this Jewish orphan girl that he uses, named Esther, to fulfill his promises. No one could have ever imagined or expected that. All of the ways, of all of the things. I mean, when God asked Saul to go and to attack and kill the Amalekites, that would have been something that felt expected, right? For him to do. He was a leader. This orphaned Jewish girl, nobody would have ever thought that she would be the one through which God's providential work would take place. Remember, for every one visible for every one recognizable move of God, display of God's work, there are hundreds of thousands of invisible works of God that led up to that moment. Every single visible work, hundreds of thousands of invisible miracles that led up to it. Our sovereign God's providential hand, it's unstoppable, and he is never surprised. There's a very similar story to the one that we've looked at this morning and the book of Esther. I want to share it with you to round out this perspective this morning. You see, back in Genesis 3:15, God makes a promise. God makes a promise there in the Garden of Eden, and the promise says that there is a descendant of Eve who will come and crush the head of the serpent. Destroy, crush Satan. This is a promise that's echoed by Moses when he tells the people of Israel that there's a prophet that's coming who is far greater than him. Of course, the Jews can't imagine that. The promise is echoed then when we see the words that are given to David, that there is a descendant of his who's going to come, and his kingdom is going to be forever. He'll be placed on an eternal throne. It was a promise that was echoed for generations. And yet the very people who would have told the stories and recited the promises didn't recognize him when he showed up. They would have never expected that this promise of God that they all were so aware of, that went back to the Garden of Eden and then was repeated by Moses and then coming through David, all of these times through the prophets of the Old Testament, would then come to fruition through a man who was born in an animal stable of unwed parents. No one could have ever imagined. Incredibly unexpected, unrecognized. The separation between God and us, separation that existed, was the promise that God was giving, that I will come and I will crush, I will destroy that separation. I will come and I will create a way so that that distance isn't there any longer. Promise given in the garden. And the Apostle Paul says it this way: for if because one man's trespass, death reigned through that man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in the life through the one man, Jesus Christ. So the promise of this separation, the fulfillment of God's coming, and this promise of destruction, of destroying, crushing literally the head of Satan and the evil and sin in the one man, Jesus. He goes on to say, this is chapter 6 of Romans, for if we have been united with him, talking about Jesus, in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. So behind this visible work, the cross, there could be nothing more visible than the cross of Christ, right? The crowds gathered, they saw this moment of Jesus dying on the cross, and then his resurrection. They showed up. You've all heard the story. They rushed to the tomb, and the tomb's empty. I mean, nothing more visible than that. But think for a minute as you look through the pages of this book, how many things would have been invisible to them that led up to that moment. They didn't have any idea God was taking and he was orchestrating in his providence the beautiful sound of this symphony as each, whether it's a string section or it's the horns or it's the percussion, that all of it is coming together to make this beautiful sound that harmonizes amidst the death and resurrection of Jesus. No one would have ever known. No one who was walking in the middle of it knew what was going on. Behind that visible work of God fulfilling that promise from Genesis 3:15 and the cross and resurrection of Jesus, hundreds of thousands of invisible miracles, providential works of God. So when you and I, as we've been talking about identity, and we've at the same time been traveling through this book of Esther, and we've been looking at God's providence and his sovereignty and all of these historical events as they're unfolding. When we hear the words, by grace you have been saved through faith, I referenced this verse, I think, in our very first week of Esther. It says, not of your own doing, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. That's a promise that is being fulfilled in you and I today as those who place our identity in Jesus. You can place your full confidence. You can place 100% of your confidence in your identity being found securely in our God. By his grace, through faith, that he is accomplishing his perfect plan. He is accomplishing the good works that he's prepared beforehand for us. And that's whether or not we're in a season that's characterized by the hundreds of thousands of invisible works of God, or you may be in one of the seasons characterized by actually being able to see and know, recognize what God's doing. It doesn't matter which one you're in. You can place every bit of your confidence in who he is and what he says he will do, no matter what the voices of our culture say, no matter what they're saying about you, no matter what our culture's definitions are for you, no matter what our culture's expectations are for you. Regardless of how your circumstances in life may feel, God is still sovereign over all things. It's through his providential work, both the visible and the invisible, that he always fulfills his promise. Always. And when we began reading the book of Esther, I don't think anyone in here, if I would have to ask you the question, are we going to see a promise of God fulfilled in Esther that had been generations and generations old, given way back as the people of Israel were trying to flee from slavery in Egypt? I think most of you wouldn't have said, oh, of course, that makes total sense. But that's when God decided to do it. He is sovereign. He is working constantly and steadily. And so today, as you're navigating, like I say, whatever it may be, whatever, the circumstances are difficult, they're hard, or you're amidst the victory, whichever, you can place every ounce of your confidence, your identity, who you are, in him, because he will continue. Quote the verse. You are his workmanship. You are his craftsmanship. You were created in Christ Jesus, and you were created for good works. That's his promise that's being fulfilled in you. Just like his promise. Vindicate the Jews as he defended them against the Amalekites, just like his promise to crush the head of Satan way back in Genesis 3:15. There is a promise here. You created in Christ Jesus for good works, that God prepared those beforehand so that you can walk in them. So if the trees of life are smacking you in the face, hear the words and be reminded of the promises of God, that the forest, if you can zoom out and look at it for just a minute, is a big narrative of God's grace, his rescue of you. He reigns supreme on his throne. He is sovereign over all things, and he is working in all things. Amen. Let that be a reminder to all of us this morning. I invite you to bow your heads and close your eyes with me. Maybe it's acknowledging the reality of those truths and that perspective amidst some specific things that are going on in your life. And so maybe in this just time of response and prayer here, maybe it's just something as simple as in a posture of prayer saying, God, I know that even amidst this situation at work, this situation at home, I know that I'm yours. I know that you reign supreme. It's just saying that in prayer, a powerful reminder of who he is, who you are, who your identity is in him. And Father, I just ask that your Spirit would move amidst your word and the hearts and the minds, the lives of those who are gathered here this morning, those who may be online, and just, Father, help us amidst all of these individual circumstances of life, all of the tree moments. Father, help us to zoom out and to remember the ways that you are faithful in all things. Father, in the same way that you were faithful to fulfill this promise in Esther, through all of this, so many invisible works to arrive at a visible work that we see in chapter 9. And Father, the same with the gospel story, that you're doing the same in our own lives. There will be many times when we don't see it, we can't recognize it, but Father, would you give us the faith and the trust? You are still sovereign. You are still working providentially amidst all of the things going on around us. Father, I just ask that you would give the courage to respond in whatever way is appropriate this morning. If it's something that we need to do differently as we walk out these doors, if it's something that we need a conversation that we need to follow up on, if it's just a way that, Father, we need to think differently about some things that are going on in life, Father, would you give us the courage and give us the faith to respond to who you are and what you've done, to your word this morning. We'll have some prayer leaders that are up at the front of the room to your left this morning who would love to join you in prayer. Any of our elders would love to join with you and pray. We'll be scattered around this room, and whether it's something that has to do with what we discussed in the book of Esther and this story, or it can have absolutely nothing to do with it, we would still love to join you in prayer. If you have placed your faith in Jesus at any point along the way in your journey, then in this response time, you're invited to these communion tables. You're invited to come up here, and we do this every Sunday, and we don't do it out of habit or ritual. We do it as an act of worship. approaching the table, taking the cup, which represents the blood of Jesus that was shed for us, and the bread representing his body broken for us. And as Paul says, every time we come and we take these, we proclaim his death until he returns in glory. Would you respond to him this morning?